Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, do you trust that your vote is being counted? If not, polls say you've got lots of company. We asked Chellie Pingree of Common Cause how to make our electoral and political systems truly accountable. Could there be another Katrina? You bet, argues author Mike Tidwell, and next time it might be the D.C.-Baltimore area that gets submerged. Do you have a right to join a union? That answer, says former Labor Board member Sarah Fox, might be about to change. Also, we've got traditional fiddle music by Alan Jabor and a poetry blitz with Berrroa, Derrick Weston Brown, Grace Cavalieri, Reuben Jackson, Sami Miranda, and Lisa Pegram on The Coffee House. Welcome to the forum at the Coffee House. When you go to the polls, are you totally confident your vote will actually be counted, and counted for the candidate of your choice? It's not just wild-eyed conspiracy theorists who worry that an election without a paper trail is an invitation to fraud. That's a hot topic in Maryland right now. But ballot security is just one of many barriers to a truly fair electoral system. The good news is there are watchdogs around like Chellie Pingree pushing to make our democracy all it can be. Chellie Pingree is the president and chief executive officer of Common Cause. Common Cause was founded in the 1970s to ensure that voices of ordinary citizens get heard in the political process and that politicians are held accountable. Before coming to Common Cause, Pingree ran a farm and a wool knitting business and served as the leader of the Maine Senate. She also made an unsuccessful bid for the U.S. Senate in 2002. Welcome, Chellie, to the Coffee House.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
1971 was when your organization was founded. We're in 2006. Would you say today our political system is more or less accountable than Common Cause was formed?
It's probably less accountable. You know, we were started in 1971 by John Gardner, who was actually the only Republican in the Johnson administration. He got this idea. His slogan was everybody's organized but the people. He was very worried about special interests. He was actually concerned about the war and the funding for the war, took out full-page ads in the newspaper and had 200,000 members in a year. People were very angry. But when we go back and look at the many books that John Gardner wrote, you think that you're reading about something that happened just yesterday when he talks about the lack of accountability, the lack of confidence in our political system, the failure of democracy, the incredible influence of money in politics, our inability to trust some of the media. It goes on, and you think, oh my goodness, you know, we haven't gotten very far in 35 years.
Do you think that's a failure of your organization?
It's a lot of weight on our shoulders and our very diligent members. You know, I have to say we're working very hard, and there's a lot of other, you know, good colleague organizations. I do think, you know, in many ways it's a failure of our system, and it's a failure of many of us sometimes to recognize how fundamental it is to have a democracy that functions. You know, sometimes it's easy to get engaged on important issues like, you know, the economy or healthcare or issues like the war, but if we forget about how the system works and whether or not every vote is going to be counted, or whether there's a lot of special interest money going into the political process and the people you care about never get a chance to get elected, we're going to be in the kind of trouble we're in today.
In Maryland, Maryland was a pioneer state in the use of ballots without paper.
Right.
And it continues to have that kind of ballot system, electronic balloting, without a paper trail. A lot of states have adopted electronic balloting, but have paper trails. Does that mean that we should be concerned in Maryland that our votes really aren't being counted, or are we being perhaps a little paranoid about this?
I think Maryland voters are very right to be concerned. In the most recent report that we issue, we look at Maryland as one of the states that we consider in high danger of people not both feeling confident about their voting system, and in fact there being a situation which has happened in many states around the country where something has gone on, there's been a need for a recount, or there's been some abnormality, and you don't have a paper ballot to go back and look at. So we're recommending that Maryland pass a law to change the system. A law did start working its way through the legislature this year. It didn't get to the end, but we're going to keep fighting for it.
It passed the House. It had the support of the governor ultimately, but it didn't get through the
Exactly, exactly. But it's an issue that many people are very concerned about. There's actually also a federal bill which we're supporting and has got an increasing number of co-sponsors, both Republicans and Democrats. This isn't really a partisan issue. I mean, every person who goes through an election worries about whether or not there will be a problem with their voting. And the closer our elections become, the more of an issue this is. Maryland is one of those states that has no-fault absentee, so we actually recommend in those states that people go get an absentee ballot and vote on a piece of paper.
Now, what does it mean, no-fault absentee?
Well, it means you can ask for an absentee ballot without even having to say, yes, I have to work that day, or I'm going to be in Florida or visiting my cousin. Increasingly, many states are moving this because of the lifestyles people lead. You know, a lot of people can't get out of work, or they're, you know, picking up the kids after school. For whatever reasons, it's harder and harder for people to vote. So more and more states have that. But the fact is, more and more states are passing laws to require a paper ballot and also regular auditing.
Another issue that you're very concerned about is the financing of elections. You're advocating public financing in various states for all the state races. There's a bill for congressional races to do the same thing. This is different, however, than what we know of presidential races, which are based on matching funds?
Right. I mean, just to give you a little idea about how the system works, and again, Maryland has been looking at this bill. It's passed through the House. It came out of a Senate committee, so we're going to be putting a full court press on it again next year when we think there'll be, you know, a new legislature and a new look at it. It's a system people call clean elections. Maine and Arizona both have the system, and I was formerly in Maine. I'm very familiar with the system. Basically, you collect a limited number of signatures from people in your district, and you ask them to give you $5, so they've made a contribution to your campaign. Once you qualify as a candidate, you get an allocation of money from a state fund, a reasonable amount of money to run your campaign, but doesn't get it into this ridiculous arms race that we have going on. If your opponent doesn't use the system and they raise more money privately, or they put in their own money, you're actually matched up to 3 times the allocation. So you're protected against an opponent that can raise more money. What's happened in states like Maine, where now about 80% of the legislators are running under this system, is it's a completely different way, you know, to go about running for office. You don't have big developers and pharmaceutical companies and the tobacco industry pouring money into races. You have average citizens giving their $5, and then you have candidates who actually have to come out and knock on doors and meet voters and make a good case for why they should be under the system. When I served in the legislature, we didn't have it in Maine, but I currently have a daughter who serves in the legislature in her 20s, and she won under this system. It brings a whole new group of people into the system of politics.
So what's the impediment?
Usually the impediment is elected officials, sitting politicians who don't want to change the system that got them elected. When you talk to the public about this, they believe very strongly that this is a corrupt system and that there's too much influence of money in the process. Maryland's one of those states where there's all kinds of contributions that come in from limited liability corporations, all kinds of places where you don't know where the money is going into these election campaigns. So we're advocating that states like Maryland, states around the country do this, and we're actually running a pledge drive right now to ask people who are running for Congress, the United States Senate or the House, to sign a pledge saying when they get to Congress, they're going to clean it up and they're going to pass clean elections at the federal level as well.
One of the things that the media often uses to determine whether a candidate is legitimate or not is how much money they've raised.
Right. And, you know, if you really think about it, do you want to know that your person could raise more money, you know, that they could pick the pockets of more special interests, or that they could hold more fundraisers? Or
How much money does it cost, for instance, to be in the U.S. Senate today?
You know, it's scary. They say on average that a United States Senator has to raise $13,000 a day for every day of their 6-year term. So you think you send somebody to the United States Senate to make difficult decisions and, you know, spend their time debating on the floor. Frankly, half the time you find them out at a fundraiser with lobbyists, making phone calls to people to ask them to give money. I mean, many of them don't like the system
either. And you know this personally because you went through this, right?
I do. I ran for the United States Senate in 2002, and I had to raise, you know, at least $3,000 in no more than $1,000 contributions. That was the limit at the time. I spent a lot of my time, I used to say, sitting in a little white room calling up people literally all over the country saying, would you help me run for the United States Senate? Can you write a check? I'd even say, I can take your credit card now. I mean, was I a telemarketer or was I a potential United States Senator? And I had been the majority leader of the Senate. I passed a bill on prescription drug pricing. I'd worked on all kinds of incredible issues. I wanted to be out talking to voters about that. But the truth is, that's what challengers do, but that's what incumbents do too. You know, I used to come down to Washington and visit with my, potential future colleagues, and they'd all be sitting in little white rooms too, even if they were already members of the United States Senate, because that's the way the system works. And as you can see, and voters will know, they're turning in on TV right now and seeing that there's just an incredible number of commercials. It costs a lot of money to put your message on TV, and you do that by raising money one phone call at a time.
Recently, we had the experience of a presidential election in which the person who won the popular vote lost the presidency, maybe perhaps because the electoral vote was thrown to the other candidate in the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, it does not assure you the presidency if you win the popular vote. You're advocating a change in the system, and in fact, there's movement in that direction, at least in California. That's
right. We're advocating a plan in all 50 states to eliminate the Electoral College. We think that it's time to have a direct election of the president. Again, as you know, in every other election, whether it's your city council or state legislature or member of Congress, your vote decides, which way the election's going to go. But in this complicated system that we have that most people don't understand, and it would take 3 of your shows to actually describe how the Electoral College works or doesn't work, people's vote doesn't necessarily always go where they want it to go. So we're advocating a different system. There's been a proposal that started in the California legislature and was probably going to spread to legislatures all over the country this year, really to make sure that we go back to a system, or that we start a system that mimics the other kinds of elections.
You're concerned, in addition, not just about the political system, but influences on it from the outside, for instance, the media. And you've been very involved with the issue of net neutrality. Explain what that is and what your concern is with these apparent grassroots organizations that maybe are not that.
Right. Well, we spend a lot of time trying to understand which is a citizens movement and which is a big lobbying firm creating a citizens movement to make you think that, they always get those perfect names about how this is fair and great and apple pie, and really it's, sponsored by a telecommunications company. But basically what we're looking at, and we're concerned about the media across the board, who owns the media and how do you make sure that people really get access to information. It's not for us because, we're worried about what your TV shows are. We're really worried about the stakes in a democracy of making sure people get good information. And as all of us know, we're increasingly turning to the internet for that. So one of the big concerns about this idea of net neutrality is making sure that the internet stays free and open, as it does today. We think it requires a certain amount of regulation to make sure that everything that you want to see on the internet continues to come to you at the same speeds, that you don't pay different prices, for big,
In other words, you're not guided toward a particular destination on the internet because that's the most lucrative one for the sponsor.
Exactly. And today you can Google or click on anything and you'll find the same information at the same speed as if it was a large commercial site or a small site. And it's a very big issue. We've been working on this issue of media ownership, but you can see much of the debate is now shifting to the internet because it won't be long, and it's already moving in that direction, that that everything, whether you're downloading a movie or watching a political ad, will be on your laptop computer, probably somewhere at a Starbucks.
I saw that in the Philadelphia airport just a week ago.
There you go.
Many thanks to Chellie Pingree of Common Cause for joining us and for her efforts to make democracy real in our own backyard. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Coffee House Forum.
From Lincoln to Lenin, from Bolivar to Zapata, the statues of the masculine heroes of the earth, the matriarchs, are already profane forever with the odorless gray that adorns their heads. It is the peaceful doves that are responsible for this attack on the virile temple of our fatherland, doves that vindicate, wanting to make us believe they don't know what they are doing, the place the useless statues occupy in the soul of the people. Statues raised by the hunger of the politician to the illustrious male that served them as bait. Thus they fill these people's brains with drooling hopes and incongruent promises. Is this what the doves think in coming in and perching on the cranium of the statue? They are carrying out certain activity that destroys the idea we had so sacred about the heroes of the fatherland?
People's Drug Store, aisle 7. The velvety rubber of the tiny ball held my thumbprint for 10 seconds before it disappeared. It was the perfect balance between Huffy Sweet Thunder and Hubba Bubba Gum Pink. The wood on the paddle was creamy. The rubber band between the ball and the paddle was iridescent white, so as the ball danced back and forth, it caught rainbows in the light. I had to have it. Mom said, absolutely not. The curve in the look she shot me decimated the oncoming pout. While she piled Nivea lotion, cotton balls, Calgon, peroxide, and toothpaste on the counter, I slipped it in the inside pocket of my windbreaker. I was only 5, clueless to the gravity of my action. So 5 blocks up the road, I pulled it out and said, "Mommy, surprise." She snatched it out of my hand, beat me with it, and sent me back to the store to confess with splinters in my behind.
Hi, and welcome to a second look at the coffee house. Cassandra wasn't appreciated in her day either. There are plenty of people in the Washington area who wish Mike Tidwell would just go away. Why? Well, Mike has issued us a warning. The same kind of flood that ruined much of New Orleans could happen to us. It could smash across the District of Columbia and other local cities built on former swampland. What makes Mike a little harder to ignore is the fact that he predicted the New Orleans catastrophe in one of his earlier books. Now he's written another book called The Ravaging Tide, Strange Weather, Future Katrinas, and the Coming Death of America's Coastal Cities. We're used to having Mike seated in the host chair here at the coffee house, but today he's our guest, and today I get to play devil's advocate. And let me just start by saying, okay, you're here to sell books. I'm here to jack up the ratings, sort of. But for the people watching, this is scary stuff. This seems very serious. I mean, are we to believe that Katrina wasn't just one in 100-year storm? It was really part of a pattern?
Without question. I mean, if you really look at Katrina and the destruction to New Orleans, there are 2 major things we should focus on. The reason it happened was, 1, New Orleans is below sea level. It's a city that lives behind levees. And 2, it was hit by a massive hurricane. And Katrina was a massive hurricane. She was a Category 5 out in the Gulf until right before she came ashore. She brought a Category 5 surge, 30 feet of water, largest surge tide ever experienced anywhere in American history. So 2 things, a city below sea level, massive hurricane. Because of global warming, even according to the Bush administration, we're going to see up to 3 feet of sea level rise worldwide in the coming decades, which means that Miami will be mostly below sea level, big parts of Washington, D.C. below sea level, Baltimore, lower Manhattan completely below sea level, all of them behind levees because the ocean rose 3 feet. On top of that, hurricanes in the Atlantic basin are becoming more intense. So you've got cities below sea level in coming decades and more intense hurricanes, which means you get New Orleans and Katrina type events everywhere.
Okay, so the picture you're drawing is that we here living in the D.C. area are going to be behind levees just like down south.
Yeah, or floodgates. Here on
floodgates.
Coffee House just a few months ago, we had a professor from the University of Maryland who was saying, look, we're going to need a floodgate on the Potomac River near Mount Vernon. We're going to need one on the Patapsco to keep back the surge tide in Baltimore. So this is a reality. Again, this is not Greenpeace saying this. This is even the Bush administration saying we're going to get this kind of sea level rise. And there have been 6 major studies just in the last 12 months, all documenting that hurricanes are becoming bigger. They're becoming more frequent. The biggest hurricanes are becoming more frequent. Wind speeds are rising. And it's all related to sea level rising sea surface temperatures linked to global warming.
Well, I know the research seems more and more persuasive all the time, but nonetheless, is this going to happen soon?
It's already happening. I mean, just look at the hurricane season of 2005. Of the 6 most powerful hurricanes ever recorded in the last 150 years, 3 of them happened in 52 days in 2005, Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. The hurricane season of 2005 broke almost all the major records. We're seeing more intense hurricanes, and sea level rise is happening. I mean, we're seeing it on the Chesapeake Bay. The islands in the bay are disappearing. Smith Island in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay is losing, in some places, 30 feet of shoreline a year. So sea level rise is happening. It's right now. It's not coming later. It's already here, and hurricanes are becoming more powerful. And it's time we started to acknowledge this and do something about it.
Now, something you had mentioned, that the methane being released from the Siberian tundra as it thaws is a powerful, potent addition to the greenhouse gases.
Every week there's a new study saying describing some new expression of runaway climate change, whether it's methane, which traps heat and is being released from thawing tundras in Siberia, to wildfires that are completely off the charts in the American West, to heat waves like the kind we saw in the summer of 2006. So we've got enough awareness. We know it's happening. The cat's out of the bag. Now it's time to move to action.
Okay, so we should be scared, and therefore, should we just get drunk, have fun until the end comes?
Well, as New Orleans demonstrated, that method doesn't work. We've got to do something about it. And the good news is there's a lot we can do. I mean, what we need to do is get off fossil fuels as fast as we can. And there are a lot of people who say, one, we can't get off fossil fuels, or if we do, it'll take too long, both of which are not true. We can get off fossil fuels in a hurry. For example, if every car in the United States 10 years from now had the exact kind of hybrid technology engine that I have in my Toyota Prius that I drove to the studio tonight, if every car just had that technology, not something new and fancy, just that technology, 10 years from now, we'd cut our gasoline use in half, and we would reduce aggregate CO2 emissions by 25%. There's lots we can do. We can do it in a hurry. We just need a policy.
Well, we're talking about your carbon footprint. You drive a Prius. You're a vegetarian. So this is the lifestyle we should adopt.
Well, and it's one without sacrifice, really. I have a very modern lifestyle. I have a nice car. I power my house with wind power and solar power and corn, and nobody can tell the difference when they come in my house. This is something we can do. It's just that we haven't made up our minds to exploit the very resources that are right here in Maryland.
All right. So, but if enough people listen to you and make this personal choice, will that solve things?
Well, everybody needs to make their own personal voluntary choices, to drive a more fuel-efficient car and to change light bulbs and all that. But more than anything, we need to change laws. This is a nation of laws, and if we want to change this nation, we have to change the laws. And we can do that in a hurry. We need to make it illegal for Detroit to roll off the lots one car that gets less than 50 miles to the gallon. They should all have to get that much. We need to make it illegal to burn coal the way we're burning now and have incentives for wind power and solar and energy conservation. So we need to change our nation's laws to move us in that direction, in the same way that we changed the laws in the civil rights movement to get us to a more equitable society.
During the Carter administration, I was part of some meetings where it was talked about using capitalism to make this happen. That is, if the federal government, by edict, decided to go into alternative energies more or less immediately, that they would become such a huge customer that Detroit and every other, and Exxon and everybody else would have to change to meet the customer demand.
Well, I think that we need to use the creativity of the marketplace, and we can use it to make the switch to clean energy. Simply, for example, if we were to say 10 years from now, all cars, the American auto fleet has to average 50 miles per gallon. We don't care how you do it, Detroit, Toyota, we don't care how you do it, but you got to hit this benchmark. You would see amazing creativity working toward that benchmark. And that's why, California already sets high auto emission standards, and they're beginning to regulate carbon dioxide. And other states have adopted California standards, including Maryland right now. There's a bill that's going to be introduced in January in Maryland that would have Maryland adopt California standards instead of staying with the federal standards, because theirs are more ambitious. So right here in Maryland, there's so much we can do. There are voluntary steps you can take. You can get involved in grassroots movement to pass clean energy laws in Maryland and the district. There's a clean car law before the D.C. Council right now. Virginia's working toward a clean electricity standard. So while nothing's happening in Washington because ExxonMobil has a headlock on Congress, the states are moving forward, and that's what's exciting. And people need to not be overwhelmed. The issue of sea level rise and more powerful hurricanes and wildfires and polar ice melting is very, very scary. The good news is there's a lot we can do, and we need to do it now.
Well, okay, but if I'm reading you correctly, you're saying that personal choice and really this patchwork of laws at the municipal level or even at the state level fundamentally isn't going to do anything unless we do it at the federal level and at the worldwide, international level.
That's right. We do need a change in federal policy. We need the United States to stop. We need the United States to join reality, to join the rest of the world in recognizing this global problem and be part of the Kyoto Protocol or some other global process that brings down CO2 emissions. That's not happening in Washington. It's probably not going to happen with the bunch who are in power now. The good news is Republicans in California and New York State and Democrats in other states, red and blue states, are making a move in mandating cleaner energy, and this is forcing gradually, it's going to force a federal policy. Detroit right now is going to have to start building cleaner cars, not because the federal government said so, but because California did. So, but ultimately, we really need a change in Washington. The states are pushing Washington in the right direction, and we've got to join the rest of the world.
So should we be pushing Al Gore to become the nominee for president?
Well, I have to think that but for a few Chads on the floor in Florida, Al Gore would have been president on 9/11, in September 11th, and I really believe that we would have had a completely different country right now, because he would have had the entire country behind us, and he would have said, we are going to get off fossil fuels, and nobody could have stopped them because the country would have been behind him. Having said that, however, he's not president. He did lose, although he had a majority vote, as we saw earlier. I don't think he's going to run. I think he's determined that he can do more for global warming as a private citizen, ringing the alarm bells and showing this way toward clean energy.
Now, someone suggests that he should run for vice president again, that Dick Cheney having redefined the position that he could take as his mandate global warming and
use the Patriot Act to make it happen.
But it is, you're optimistic that this can happen, that we can turn things around?
I'm optimistic that it can happen. The jury's still out as to whether we're going to make it happen. The good news is there's a positive vision here. If you live in Maryland, imagine no more code red smog days, no more mountaintop removal in West Virginia, no more women of reproductive age with mercury poisoning from burning coal, no more acid rain, no more nitrogen flows into the bay, killing the bay, no more 9/11s, no more Iraq war, no more sea level rise, no more hurricanes, no more global warming. All of that from switching to clean energy. The multiplier benefits of clean energy are staggering, and it's time we recognize as a nation that so many of our economic, national security, and health problems and environmental problems are directly related to our energy choices. There's a positive vision out there for clean energy. If we embrace it, we solve so many problems at the same time. I'm optimistic that we'll get there. I just hope we get there fast enough.
Well, but realistically, isn't it going to take another Katrina or more than another Katrina to make it happen?
I want to believe that we don't need any more Katrinas to get going. But, a friend of mine says human beings have to learn everything the hard way. You know, one world war wasn't enough to sell Europeans on peace. We had to have two. I hope we don't need two Katrinas. The way we're going now and the slowness with which we're joining the rest of the world and dealing with global warming may argue that another Katrina has to happen. But I have to believe that, you know, with clean energy laws in Maryland and Virginia and D.C. and California, we'll get there. And awareness is rising, and more people are getting involved, and there's a real movement taking hold. And you can learn more at ChesapeakeClimate.org.
Right, Mike runs that organization while he's not writing books. And so, bottom line, you think we're going to survive as a species?
Oh, we'll survive.
Yeah, okay.
We will. You know, I hope there's still, you know, 6 to 10 billion of us who survive. There may be fewer, but, you know, and nature will survive. You know, there's the saying that nature always bats last. You know, she may be completely different, and if the worst case scenario happens with global warming, we may lose half of our species on the planet. But I don't like to go there. You know?
Fair enough.
We're going to make it happen.
Let's not go.
ChesapeakeClimate.org.
Good to have you with us again, Mike. Even if you are the bearer of bad tidings, tell you the truth, I wish Mike was just blowing smoke to sell books, but I'm afraid he is seriously correct. We are in the bullseye, and we've been warned. I'm Howard Cohen, and this has been A Second Look.
I smelled you at the metro stop, tasted you on the yellow, glimpsed you on the green, caught you on the orange, loved you on the red, lost you on the blue. Now I need a transfer, or at least exit fare, 'cause no one deserves to take such a ride and end up being taken for every dime. Baby, you would last minute change your plans. An unexpected phone call at the God hour that leaves me feeling mortal.
Why not write the poem you can sell? Your aunt wants a book by the bed. She doesn't know how lightning starts from the ground, so invent it again, starting in the sky, not connected to anything that can burn. If leaves turn inside out with indication of rain, spin them around again, calling it the opposite of pain. Say it's seasonal. Finish the sentence, I remember, rather than I don't want to remember. Using the language like cloth to conceal the broken body beneath. Never talk of how you love the smell of your own pillow. People don't want personal remarks like that, or how you learned of love by watching other people's happiness. If your father lay down and covered his eyes with light before you could say you were sorry, do not discuss goodbyes or other family secrets, even if fear made the mourning dove fly. Blame it on the sky.
Welcome to Work Life at the Coffee House. Not many people know it, but any day now, a small agency of the federal government, the National Labor Relations Board, will issue a decision that could affect your right to join a union. Under labor law, supervisors may not join a union. The issue that the NLRB will decide is whether millions of workers who today are in unions, or who could be, will be labeled supervisors and thereby be denied the right to union membership. What are we to make of all this? Let's ask Sarah Fox, a leading expert on labor law and a former member of the NLRB during the Clinton administration. I had the pleasure of serving with Sarah when I was the NLRB General Counsel. Sarah, thank you for joining us today at the Coffee House.
Thank you.
So let's start with, what is the NLRB? What is its role?
Well, the National Labor Relations Board is the federal agency which is responsible for administering the National Labor Relations Act, and that is the primary federal statute that regulates labor management relations in the private sector. The board itself consists of 5 members who are appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate, and they make decisions interpreting the act and applying the act in real-world situations.
Okay, so there's a big issue that's pending before the agency about supervisors, nurse supervisors specifically. So tell us, what is this issue?
Well, the National Labor Relations Act, which was enacted in 1935, it was really one of the centerpiece statutes of the Roosevelt New Deal, guarantees to employees the right to organize and to bargain collectively and provides certain legal protections for them in exercising those rights. Up until, for many, many years after the statute was first enacted, the term employee was considered to cover supervisors. So even supervisors were allowed to form unions, although the board took the position they couldn't be in the same union as the people that they actually supervised. And the courts had upheld that, and the Supreme Court had upheld that. But in 1947, the Republican, at that time, Republican Congress, over the veto of President Truman, passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which, among other things, prohibited excluded supervisors from this definition of employees. And what that means is that a supervisor no longer has a protected right to join a union, that they can be disciplined or discharged, fired for engaging in union activities. They can be expected to toe the employer's line, and they have no protection under the Act for if that should happen. And since that happened, there has been an issue about who is or who is not a supervisor, and that's one. When I was on the board, many, many cases came before the board where questions arose as to whether a certain kind of employee should be categorized as a supervisor or not.
Okay, so this issue has been percolating for quite some time. When do you think the board's going to issue this decision?
Well, it's expected actually that the decision may come out as soon as the end of this month. The board works on the federal government's fiscal year, and there's usually a push at the end of the fiscal year to get decisions out, and we have some reason to believe that they have put this on their agenda to try to get out by the end of September.
Okay, but you've indicated that this is an issue that's been around for quite some time. You know, when we were at the agency, this was an issue. Why this issue now?
Well, as I said, even after the National Labor Relations Act was after the Taft-Hartley Act was enacted, the board took a position in that the people who should be considered supervisors were relatively high-level people who actually were representing the employer in their dealings with lower-level workers. And that interpretation was upheld by and large by the courts up until the early 70s, when a case went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said to the National Labor Relations Board, we're not saying that the particular people you are saying are supervisors, aren't supervisors, should be considered supervisors, but the rationale you have used to find them not to be supervisors, we don't think can be squared with the Act. Board, go back and try again.
And that was the early 90s, right?
Excuse me, that was the early 90s.
So that was a case that had the same issue that this case has, right? And it went up to the Supreme Court in the early 90s, and what happened?
And this is what the court said, that the board did not have the proper rationale. Board, go back and try again.
Okay, so now, this is, again, when we were there, what happened after that decision?
Then the board, again in 1994, tried again, issued a new set of criteria, trying to comply with the Supreme Court's mandate to square this better with the language of the statute, at least according to the Supreme Court. And once again, it went up through the courts of appeals, splits in the courts of appeals, arrived at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, try again.
Number two, courts.
Exactly.
So this issue that the board is about to hand down a decision on, perhaps as early as in the next several weeks, has been to the Supreme Court twice already, right? So now what happens when the board issues the decision this time?
Well, what people are concerned about is that this time the board is going to issue a decision that substantially narrows or substantially, expands the category of people who are considered supervisors. And just so that you understand, the Act defines a supervisor as someone who has the authority to hire, to transfer, to suspend, to lay off, to promote, to discharge other employees. But it also says you're a supervisor if you have the authority to assign other employees or to responsibly direct. And it is really the interpretation of these two criteria that have been causing the problems. Because Congress, when it passed this, made very clear in the legislative history and in statements on the floor and the committee reports that they, notwithstanding the words assign and direct, it did not mean to get relatively low-level supervisors.
Well, okay, given that history, given the congressional intent, and given the fact that it's been recognized for 50 or more years that essentially the status quo, why are people so concerned about this decision by this board at this time?
Well, the board currently has a majority of 3 Republicans who were appointed by President Bush. And since the current board and its current composition has been there, their decisions, by and large, have tended to be pro-employer and to reflect what employers are looking for. And employers here are seeking to expand the definition, expand the exclusion for supervisors, and the concern is that that is the direction the board will take.
Okay, but now this is a case about nurses, right? And I can understand why this is a big concern in the nursing industry and amongst nurses and nurses' unions. But it seems like there's a much greater concern. Why? What are the implications of this case beyond nurses? Are there implications?
Well, there are actually 3 cases before the board, one of which involves workers and others that involve different kinds of workers, one an industrial worker and one a construction worker. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the Supreme Court has said that the test for all of them needs to be the same. And the concern is that, the real concern is that people who, as part of their day-to-day job, give direction to lesser skilled employees are going to find themselves treated as supervisors under the Act and stripped of their collective bargaining rights. And for nurses, this means the kind of person, all nurses, all RNs, as part of their professional responsibility and the typical duties, say, on the floor in a hospital, give direction to certified nursing aides, to lower skilled employees, to tell them tasks that need to be done. In the construction industry, a journeyman construction worker, typically, for instance, in his relationship to apprentices on the job, will be giving direction to those apprentices, instructing them and directing them as how to perform the work.
Okay, do we have any sense of the dimensions of this then? I mean, how many workers might be affected? Has anyone looked at that?
Well, the Economic Policy Institute has done a study based on looking at data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they have estimated that approximately 8.3 million workers in the U.S. workforce could potentially be affected by this decision, in that they could lose their rights to unionization, to collectively bargain, and their protections from retaliation should they engage in union activity.
Can we localize that number? Did they break these numbers?
Yes, they have done a state-by-state breakdown, and just looking at 8 or 10 of the professions, maybe 20 professions that are most likely to be affected, they found that in Maryland, almost 50,000 people. In Virginia, 65,000 people.
So these are people, 50,000, 65,000 in
and
Virginia.
And in D.C., 12,000.
Who would essentially lose the right to union membership.
Could conceivably, under this decision, lose their right. And this is not just people who may, in the future, decide they want to join a union, but people who are currently members of unions and covered by collective bargaining agreements who could find themselves in a position where the employer could insist that they either quit the union or lose their jobs.
Right. And let's localize it even further. I mean, what could this mean to an individual worker? I mean, how might this play out?
Well, let's say that you're a registered nurse who works at a local hospital, and this decision comes out, and as a result, the fact that you give direction to certified nursing aides who work under you has made you a supervisor for purposes of the National Labor Relations Act. And say the employer says to you, you're a supervisor now, you have to quit the union. You have to quit the union, but let's say you then criticized the decision and gave a statement to a newspaper reporter saying that you thought this was unfair or that you thought it was wrong that you should have to leave your union. Your employer could fire you for that. And you suddenly would be without the basic protections of the National Labor Relations Act, which say that it is unlawful to discriminate against any employee on account of their union activity.
Okay, so the board hands down its decision. Is that it? Is that the final word on this?
Well, the interesting thing, and I think it's illustrated by the fact that this is an issue that since the early 90s and just the last 10 or 12 years has been up to the Supreme Court twice, that it is probably going to go back up to the Supreme Court. But before it gets there, there's a lot of litigation that is going to take place in the courts of appeals, and it may be several years before it makes its way to the Supreme Court. And the other thing that could happen was that the composition of the National Labor Relations Board could change in a few years if we get a different president, if we get a Democratic president who appoints people who are more sympathetic to worker interests in organizing and collective bargaining. So, you know, this issue can be around causing problems and upheaval and labor unrest for many years.
So it's already been close to 15 years, and the end is nowhere in sight,
Right.
even though we're about to pass an important threshold with this board
Right.
decision.
And because things are so uncertain in this area, it affects not just these workers themselves, but other workers around them who are trying to organize. Because when a union seeks to organize, it is often very difficult for the union to tell who is or who is not a supervisor. And this National Labor Relations Board has held that if a supervisor is involved in the organizing effort, that can cause the election to be voided,
Right.
even if the union wins. So this affects all the employees.
Well, thank you, Sarah Fox, for your keen insights on the nurse supervisor case and these other issues important to us all. Looking at the decisions by the NLRB over the past couple of years, all the indications are that the right to join a union is about to suffer another substantial blow. But we do have to wait and see how the NLRB decides the case. I'm Fred Feinstein, and this has been Work Life.
Ask Miles, one of the real founding fathers, cooling out between sets at Birdland as New York's finest approach about the cultural context for the paradiddles and flams played upside his head that steaming summer night. Had his veins not been infused with that which he birthed some time back, he might have yelled a warning loud enough for Amadou Diallo and other deceased uncredited sidemen to hear before he too bled unto Gotham's storied turf like a trumpet passage on a poorly mixed recording, and his life force, like the sails of living jazz musicians, slipped away.
At 4 in the morning, the only light you have is the one you make for yourself. Luisa carried her grillo. Luisa, who had married beatings but always fought back. Luisa, who would sit on a stone at the top of the hill and sing aguinaldos to wake Zoila. Zoila, her cousin, who made the coffee that would wake the sun. Luisa and Zoila, who would walk to town, crossing the bridge, in the middle of which they would stop to change their socks and shoes so they would not have the mountain dirt on their feet when they walked into the tobacco factory where they would devein the leaves. Luisa, who would carry Zoila home after she lost her balance and fell from the bridge onto the rocky ground below. Zoila, who would always have an arm that did not work well. Luisa, who would die because she fought back once too often. Zoila, who would die in her eldest daughter's house, listening for the aguinaldos that Luisa sang to wake her, to make the coffee that would wake the sun, so they could walk across the bridge together.
Well, that was a nice start to about to be a great show. Welcome to the Coffee House, Alan.
Thank you, Dave. Great to be here.
Pleasure to have you. What was the name of that tune?
So that's a tune. It goes by different names. One name for it is West Virginia Highway. And I like that name because I hung out a lot in West Virginia and spent time with West Virginia musicians. And so West Virginia Highway somehow speaks to me.
And the author of the tune?
Nobody knows. It's one of those tunes that came from the late 19th century. It's sort of a, if it's not ragtime, you can smell ragtime a-coming in it, you know, and it's a country rag, I'll call it, and it just floated around with different names. I learned it from Henry Reed, but also from another fiddler called Frank George, and there was a great recording of a Blue Ridge fiddler who played it from the 20s, and so, I don't know, my version sort of stitches them all together.
Now, you had a pretty interesting career in that you got to truly say, well, I liked what I did. You were director of the American Folklife Center.
That's a fact.
Which is a part of the Library of Congress.
Right.
And how many years?
I was there for 23 years, and I did an earlier stint at the library and another folklore job, and another job at the Arts Endowment also dealing with folk arts. So I spent my federal career in folk arts. People keep saying, how do you get jobs like that?
Right.
But
how did you get there originally? That's a good...
Well, the archive, which brought me there first, was there since the 20s.
Okay.
And my professor in graduate school played me these Library of Congress recordings from the 30s of Alan Lomax's documentation and stuff like that. And so when I started hanging out with fiddlers, I was also studying fiddling. And so I went to the Library of Congress for comparative understanding of where all this came from. And so the library just was the natural place to go.
I wanted to ask you about this. Who made your fiddle? What's the story
This is a French
fiddle?
fiddle, and I don't know much about it. It comes from Paris, and the maker is named Cohen Maison. Turn of the century. We've got to all train ourselves to say turn of the last century.
Oh, that's a good point.
And so turn of the last century.
1895, not 19.
And I used to have another French fiddle too, but I sold it. So, but I love the sound of French fiddles.
How many fiddles in the collection?
In
your collection?
I'm down to one.
Really?
Yeah.
Not even a backup?
Not even a backup. It's kind of scary. Am I flirting with trouble? I had two, but I kept leaving one behind. But my wife, now that we've got the kids out of the house, comes with me. So then I worry about leaving it behind.
Good point. The wife or the fiddle?
No, I worry about leaving the fiddle behind.
Okay, good.
The wife is safe, but the fiddle is in danger.
All right.
Anyway, I'm down to just this fiddle, and this is the fiddle that I was given by my parents when I moved from 3/4 size to full size.
Wow.
So I've lived with this fiddle even longer than my wife.
Wow.
More than 50 years.
And every now and then a new set of strings and off you go.
Every now and then a new set of Potter strings and then off I go again.
Yes.
Fiddles are amazing. They look so delicate and fragile, and yet you beat the dickens out of them playing away energetically.
Speaking of beating the dickens out of them, why don't you take us out with a tune? What are you going to play?
I won't play a beating the dickens out tune. I want to play a sweet, slow tune.
A waltz?
Here's a waltz that Henry Reed knew but didn't teach me, but his kids taught it to me.
Okay.
They said, oh, don't you know this tune? And I said, no, I don't. And they said, well, Daddy used to play it for us, and so I learned it from his kids. And,
that's close enough to the source.
So it's a great tune and a great waltz.